Hey, Agile people. Welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. Today, we're going to do something that I don't do very often. We're going to direct today's podcast almost exclusively to our Scrum brothers and sisters, because today's topic is about sprint goals that work. And I want to do this for a couple of reasons. One is because apparently whenever I put the words "that work" at the end of one of my podcast titles, they become immensely popular. So I've been trying to think of ways that I can do that more that make sense. So here we go, sprint goals that work. But the other thing is I've noticed in some conversations recently that there are a lot of Scrum practitioners out there that seem to really struggle with the concept of sprint goals. And so I wanted to talk about them a little bit. Now, if you're not a Scrum person, learning about sprint goals in exhaustive detail is probably not going to do a lot for you, but you might think about it anyway. I would consider listening, first of all, because it would mean a lot to me and it would really help me out. And you know that I love you unconditionally. I would kill for you guys. I've done so in the past. But the other reason you might want to pay attention is because the principles behind coming up with a good sprint goal are just kind of good product development, product management ways of thinking. As you build out a product in an iterative manner, you are going to need to be able to define those increments of value that you're adding to the product and measuring. And so some of the things I'm going to say here today may help you out with product development in general, even if you're not, strictly speaking, doing Scrum. So if you don't know what a sprint goal is, you can be forgiven. It is a more recent addition to the Scrum Guide, meaning it showed up in 2013. Yes, it's true. It's been part of Scrum since 2013, for a decade. Guys, you really need to be reading the Scrum Guide every so often to make sure you're on top of what Scrum is. But honestly, I can empathize with you because when I learned Scrum for the first time, this was nowhere on the radar. And so it's something that got added in and something that got elaborated, refined, pulled back on some, made slightly more ambiguous. The sprint goal has been there for a while, but direction on it has kind of gone from very detailed to not very detailed at all. The reason that sprint goals got worked into the Scrum framework is because of the nature of the kind of software that Scrum is really suited for, and that being a product that you're building where you're having to stop periodically and examine what you're doing and think about whether you're still on the right track or not. In other words, you don't really have the product planned out. You're having to do these short increments, get something out the door, pause for a second, see what happens, get some feedback, look at the market, think about what you're doing, and then kind of decide on what the direction of your product should be going forward. So when that's the nature of your software, then having a sprint goal is very useful because you're rolling things out in sprints. Right? You have this time-boxed period where you are adding to your product. A sprint goal is just a way of stating, for this sprint, here is the value of this particular sprint. Here is the value that we are adding in to the product, and we're using this sprint to do it. If you think about your sprint backlog as the what that your team is doing, the sprint goal answers the question, why are we doing this? Why do we even have this sprint to begin with? Why is our company paying money for our developers to focus on something for 2 weeks? What are we going to get out of that? And that's what the sprint goal tells them. Typically, the sprint goal occupies a place in your sprint planning where you come up with the goal and then you select the sprint backlog items that will help you accomplish that stated goal. If you're doing it the other way around, if you are coming up with your backlog items first and then trying to construct a goal out of what you selected, I would encourage you to think very critically about what you're doing. What I find is if you're struggling with a sprint goal or you have anti-patterns around your sprint goal, that is often an indicator that either something else is not quite right or maybe even Scrum isn't necessary. A very common thing I find with teams and sprint goals is they already kind of know what user stories they want to get done next sprint, but there's not a particular unifying theme or something. And so their sprint goal is basically do the stuff we want to get done this sprint. That's basically the goal. And if that's you, I would have some serious introspective discussions over whether you need Scrum or not. Because you can do iterative delivery, you can do user story after user story after user story in a continuous flow without needing the stop-start categories to examine. And if that's the position you're in, where our sprint goal is just we pick a bunch of backlog items and that's our sprint goal, then you might not need sprints, and you might not need to reflect on the product of that particular specific sprint. And if you don't need sprints and you don't need to reflect on sprints, you might not need Scrum, and you can still do all those other things that you're used to without the overhead and infrastructure that a sprint can bring. So what you want to do is you want to come up with the goal for the sprint. What is the value? How are we going to advance the product this sprint? And that becomes sort of the North Star for that sprint, for that time box. Then you look at your backlog and you think, okay, what are the highest priority things in this backlog that we could select that would actually accomplish the sprint goal? If you're not using the sprint goal that way, if you don't need one, what are you doing, right? So having Scrum without the sprint goal, although it was possible until 2013, Scrum has learned a lot about itself, and the industry has learned a lot about Scrum. And it turns out that if your sprints don't have a goal, you just might not need them. But let's say we do need them, and if we do need them, then we need to be able to articulate, what is this sprint about? What are we doing? Why do we have this group of people together for a week or 2 weeks or however long your sprint is? What is it that they're trying to accomplish for us? What's the value? So I'm going to throw out there that a good sprint goal is a high-level statement about what you're going to contribute to the product this sprint, and most importantly, why you're going to contribute that to the product this sprint. So a couple of examples. One example of a sprint goal might be that the sprint goal this sprint is to make it possible for Canadian customers to use the payment system so we can add Canada as a new revenue stream. So shout out to all of our listeners in Canada. I love your courtesy and your hockey teams, but that would be an example of a sprint goal. Another example, allow initiatives to be tied to OKRs because this is currently our most requested capability from both existing and prospective customers. So you see, in both of those examples, I'm making sort of a high-level statement about how we're going to move the product forward, but I'm also including why that's valuable. Why is this the next thing? What are we hoping to get out of this increment? Why are we bothering to spend the next couple of weeks doing this? Now, we can talk about formats. You can go online and you can do a search for sprint goal formats, and you will find several that people like. And I don't know that any one of them is better than the other. I kind of feel about them the way I feel like user story formats. If they're useful to you, great. But a sprint goal isn't a sprint goal because of a format. A sprint goal is a sprint goal because you have captured some high-level goal for the team to accomplish and why it's worthwhile to accomplish that goal. This needs to be something that stakeholders can understand, right? This should almost be like my selling point for the sprint. Like, if my stakeholders were funding my team from sprint to sprint, the sprint goal is what I tell them as an explanation as to why they should give me money. You should give me money for this sprint because we're about to add a Canadian payment gateway to our product. And when we do that, we'll get a whole new revenue stream from Canadian customers. You see how I sold you on the sprint? That's what makes it a good sprint goal. It's something that our stakeholders should understand and be able to discuss and maybe even theoretically push back on. The sprint goal is something that we finalize during sprint planning, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about sprint goals before sprint planning or outside of sprint planning. There could be several different things that we might want to accomplish in some sprint or another, and it's that collaboration between stakeholders, the product owner, the development team, everyone who's going to be involved in the value that comes out of the sprint, coming to agreement on what that value should be and that it is in fact the most valuable thing that we could spend that sprint doing. But if we don't have a sprint goal, how are stakeholders supposed to weigh in on that? How is a product owner supposed to have those conversations with them? This is what we're using your sprint for. What else would they say? Would they just show them a list of user stories? Depending on your context, that might work out. A lot of times the user stories are at a level of granularity that most stakeholders don't care about. They think about epics. And so the sprint goal is what sort of provides that ubiquitous language around the value of each sprint that you execute inside. It's also important to note that the team commits to the sprint goal. The team does not commit to the sprint backlog. This is something that comes up a lot with Scrum Masters, maybe that got their certifications around the same time I did back in 1778, when a lot of us were taught that your plan for the sprint, the backlog items that you select, the team commits to completing those backlog items. Well, we learned real quick that this is terrible. This is not that much different than the hell we run into towards the end of a large project plan. It's just we've amortized that hell over 2-week increments, basically, when we try to commit to specific backlog items that get done every sprint. So the team does not commit to specific backlog items to get done every sprint, but they do commit to the sprint goal being accomplished. So that's another reason that the sprint goal is so useful, because as we move through the sprint, we may decide that some things are going to get done and some things aren't. What do we cut? What do we hold on to? The sprint goal gives us the guidance, right? The sprint goal tells us things that are very close to the center of that sprint goal, we got to keep those on top. Things that are peripheral to that sprint goal, we might need to let those go, save those for a different sprint. So the sprint goal can be very useful to the team in that way, and that's one of the reasons why having the sprint goal before you start hashing out backlog items can be really helpful, because it's the goal you're committing to, not the specific items. The sprint backlog can be renegotiated all the time, but the sprint goal is something that requires a much higher level decision. It's up to the organization to decide that the sprint just doesn't have value because that goal no longer has value. And that's something that transcends particular backlog items and whether we get particular backlog items done or not. This works the other way as well. Your team can work on items that are not related to the sprint goal. There's nothing that says you can't. The one thing that you can't do, though, is put the sprint goal in jeopardy. So if your team does bring in other backlog items or bug fixes or research stories or whatever it is they're going to do, those things are fine. They don't have to directly tie to a sprint goal, but you can't put the sprint goal in jeopardy. That's always going to be your highest priority. And when we have our daily stand-ups and we're talking about our progress, what are we comparing our progress against? The sprint goal. Is the sprint goal still viable? Are we still going to accomplish the sprint goal? How is our progress in light of accomplishing the sprint goal? So you see that the sprint goal is very important. It's not just some piece of fluff that got thrown into the Scrum Guide. It's not some touchy-feely thing that's just there as kind of a motivational thing or something that we can put on a piece of paper or an electronic tool somewhere and say, this is our sprint goal. Aren't goals great? Don't we all love goals? We all need to have more goals. Let's make more goals. That's not why sprint goals are there. Sprint goals are there because they help us select the backlog items for that sprint. They help us negotiate those backlog items as the sprint goes on. They help us measure our progress. And then above our Scrum team, when we're talking about stakeholders and the organization as a whole, they give the organization a way to look at the value that our team is bringing and making critical decisions about that. Is this the most valuable thing we could be doing? Is this the value that we really want to get out of our product right now? Do we want to spend a sprint getting that value? Those are all important decisions for the product owner in conjunction with the rest of the business to figure out. And a good sprint goal is going to help them do it. So I hope this discussion has helped you a little bit. I hope it explains the importance of the sprint goal and gives you some clues as to what might go into a good sprint goal. But just keep in mind, it's not optional. If you're doing Scrum, they're not optional. You need to have them. And please, don't pick a bunch of backlog items and then try to come up with some generic label on top of them. Yeah, that doesn't help anybody. You don't need sprint goals if that's what you're going to be doing for your sprint goals. But if you actually bother to have the conversation, sit down with the team and figure out what is the next leap forward we're going to make with this product and why is that valuable? How can we sell this sprint to anybody looking in from the outside? I guarantee you, you're going to come up with great sprint goals, and they are really going to help you as you do your planning and your negotiations as the sprint progresses. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.